All right, everyone, welcome to today's talk. A couple things before we get started. I'm going to keep everybody off on video for now. The reason for that is just it's going to help keep the quality of the slides a little bit higher so you guys can actually see what's going on. And then I'm also going to keep everyone muted for now as well, just because of the same concept. You should be able to see my slides at this point. There's also a chat feature. So if you have any questions that pop up as we're going through this information, just drop them into the chat. And then what I'll do is I'll go back and start answering those toward the end. That way we can just, again, try to keep everything as clean as possible. So Zoom has kind of changed some of their bandwidth requirements and things like that, just because of all, everybody going online and doing different meetings and things like that. So that way, hopefully the presentation side will be pretty high quality in terms of you actually being able to see the slides. And then at the end, we can definitely pop up, pull the videos up, things like that. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of go through, dry land training practices and really focus on, just why do we do this? What is the purpose behind this? And why do I think it's effective? And what does the research show that makes all of this effective? And then you can take this information and figure out how to apply it to, your current situation. Maybe, you don't have access to a gym or you don't have access to any sort of equipment right now. And then, also when we get back into our normal training environment, I'd love for you guys to be able to ask more questions about training, like how does this fit? Are we doing enough with our dry land? Do we need to do more? What type of volumes and things like that? So this is just going to be talk number one. Coach Bullock and I worked on about 6 different topics that we're going to go over. So this is just kind of kicking it off as kind of the all-encompassing, really helping you get your baseline for that. So if at any point you can't see my slides or you can't hear me or anything, just drop it into the chat and let me know. I'll get notified. And then obviously any questions you have pop up as well, I'll be able to answer those at the end based off what we put in the chat. So let's get into it here. First thing, I want to talk about some objectives because we're going to go through a lot and we're going to go through it pretty quickly. So today's objectives are to look at your sport-specific training practices, in this case, swimming, and understand the validity behind them. Is it something that's really well studied? Is it something that we're kind of still figuring out? How much is science? How much is art? All that type of stuff. And then we want to understand resistance training and dry land, as you might know it as, and the role of that in the performance process for swimmers. So that's something that is definitely evolving. It's something that I learn something new every day in this category, and as we see performances improve, we learn more. And then we want to offer insight on how to perform a needs analysis, and I'll explain what that is when we get there, of your sport and your goal. But essentially it's what do you need to be successful, and then equip you with the tools to sift through the mountain of social media out there. So there's a lot of interesting posts right now about things that elite level athletes are doing, and does that really fit your training? Does that actually fit what you're trying to accomplish? So we're going to keep moving on here, and I like to start. This is a video that made me crack up. So this guy's got his head in a bucket. He's using his resistance bands to mimic a stroke. And then I guess his daughter's trying to pour some water over top of his head to really make it feel swim specific. And one thing that, although this is a really funny video and, kind of poking fun at this whole thing, a lot of things I see people trying to do with dry land are not very far off from this video of, a head in a bucket, using some resistance bands, trying to mimic swimming on land. So we're really going to unpack if that's the best route forward, or what you should focus on, or what the research says you should focus on, and also the coaching side of it as well. So when it comes to dry land, there's a couple different things I personally want to accomplish as a coach, and I also want to see you guys accomplish these as athletes. And the first one is do no harm, or do not harm. And the reason for that is, if you're getting injured in dry land all the time, and don't get me wrong, injuries happen in dry land. It's impossible to be injury-free forever. We just do our best to manage that and manage the volumes that we're experiencing in training. But if you're always getting injured in dry land, then that's not really helping you perform in the water, right? The other objective for dryland is to fill in any sort of gaps that you might have. So this is where it can get a little bit more specific to your individual needs. So, one thing I think of is, vertical pulling strength. A lot of people come into the college level not being able to complete an unassisted pull-up. And one of the goals that I'll have is to get swimmers as close to an unassisted pull-up or as many unassisted pull-ups as they can do because of the value there. The third thing, building armor. So what I mean by that is just being able to handle the demands of your sport and not get injured, or not have a huge drop off after a crazy hard day in the water, and then you have to bounce back and do the same thing the next day. Do you have that armor to really keep it going? And the fourth one is increasing your athleticism, and I'll really explain that in deeper detail as we go, because becoming a better athlete is always a good call when you're trying to hit new levels of performance. So the first thing I want to talk about is a study here on swimming. And this was done with elite level swimmers that they were looking at shoulder pain and wanted to kind of figure out where shoulder pain was coming from in swimming. And, was it, from anything else outside of the water, all of those type of things. And how many people are experiencing shoulder pain when they swim. So this study was on some elite level swimmers. I sent this out ahead of time, not expecting you to dissect a study or anything like that, but just kind of setting the tone with some information that we do have available. And what they found is that 91% of these elite level swimmers reported shoulder pain. And one thing I found interesting with this study is they didn't allow anybody in that had any sort of injury, surgery type deal prior to the study, or currently had pain, before the study. So this was just that development that happened, that they're seeing in this time during this study. And it was broken down pretty nicely, 53% male, 47% female. You got a little bit of everything stroke wise. Obviously IM being one of the, smaller categories as someone who's specific to that discipline. And, they had monthly, weekly, daily reporting of this shoulder pain. And the other thing that was really interesting to me is, they only really were swimming, 6 hours a week, 6 or more hours a week was kind of the average of the swimmer, the exposure to swimming. And then about 25 miles a week was what they're seeing as like the average. And programs I know go a lot higher than that. 25 miles a week is not, uncommon. It might be more, depending on what program you're part of. I've seen programs that go way higher than this, and that, it didn't take much for this shoulder pain to develop based off of what we see in the swimming world. So if we're looking at the dryland side of things, right? So I want to pull this back to the dryland piece. This is a study looking at swimming, and our goal is to not do any harm. And we're already talking about a 91%, reporting of shoulder pain, which is pretty accurate, I think, if you look at different programs. How are we going to make a dryland program that fits and follows this first principle of do not harm? And, the first thing is, obviously, you guys, especially, this team, you guys are used to seeing the shoulder work that we do, the warm-ups for the shoulders, things of that nature. And, we're trying to minimize any sort of chance of this pain developing, or at least manage the pain if it is there, and then the main variable from that study was swim volume. So the question as a strength coach or performance coach, is it actually the best plan of attack to try to exactly mimic a swimming stroke on land? So that's something to think about. You see all these videos of people mimicking. If we go back to that original video, the guy with his head in the bucket type of deal, you remove the bucket, put them in a hinge position. We do some of those variations from time to time. But some people are taking it to the point where that's their main bulk of training on land. Based off this study, and there's plenty of other studies like this one, is the process of mimicking swimming on land really the best, route forward for what we're trying to accomplish? And from a dryland perspective as well, we have to really think about a minimum effective dose, because swimming is so high volume. Even, if you're in a low volume program, or if you've experienced low volume training, it's still high volume. A low volume practice is still very high volume on the shoulders. So, and on the hips, on the knees, ankles, you name it. So we have to follow this minimum effective dose principle to try not to cause too much buildup or anything like that that's going to cause any sort of harm to the athlete because of the nature of the sport. So throughout today's talk, I'm going to pose this question a few times, and I just want you to get you thinking because we think about sport specific training, right? And we get in this thought process that sport specific training means it has to look exactly like the sport. If it doesn't look exactly like the sport, it's not really sport specific training. And we're going to continue to unpack this a little bit more as we keep this talk going. But I want you to have this question in the back of your head: is mimicking strokes on land the most effective use of your time? The next study I want to look at and kind of unpack a little bit, this one's really interesting to me. Basically, they broke a group of people, a group of swimmers, into a couple different groups. So they had their control group that just did some swimming. They had a group that did resisted and assisted sprint exercises in the water. So think of the band around your hips, sprinting with that extra resistance and then sprinting with the assistance. And then they looked at dry land, strength training, very basic strength training program, and swimming. And they wanted to see the improvement in performance. The really neat thing about this study, what it found, and there's a couple more studies like this out there as well, is that they found that the two methods of combining swimming and dry land, or that resisted and assisted sprint option in the water, were equally as effective in increasing swim performance. So think about that a little bit. You can either hook a band, to yourself and be swimming in the water, as an added program for you to do, or you can follow a dry land program and swim in the water, and you're going to have about the same amount of improvement in performance. Both significant, both successful in their own way. But if we go back to this first study, is more swimming the answer if you can get the same amount of improvement by adding in dry land? So that's another thing to think about. Is the answer always more volume of swimming when it looks like dry land might help you get the same results as adding in that assisted or resisted sprint swimming? So something else to keep in mind there. And then, as I said earlier, if swimming already causes, because of the volume, the nature of the sport, all that type of stuff, already is known for shoulder pain, knee pain, low back. If we have an option that allows us to have kind of a different flavor, right? And it's equally as effective, or it's showing to be in the ballpark of effectiveness as swimming, or adding more swimming into the picture, should we consider that option? Is that going to lead to a more longevity piece? Is it going to keep us maybe more mentally fresh than, adding more volume in the pool? And just things like that, look at those pitfalls that you've experienced as a swimmer. And is this a potential answer to that? So that's what we're looking at from a dry land side as well. So based off of those first two studies, again, like I said, I'm going to pose this question a few times: is mimicking strokes on land the best use of your time? And, we want to continue to unpack this as we keep going. Now, one thing I want to clarify is do not harm does not mean do not push. So, you guys have been through at least a year of training so far, and there's points where we push, right? There's points where the volume gets a little bit higher from a dry land perspective. There's points where, I'm going to ask you to go 5 pounds heavier than you've done before. And we're going to have that push, because that push, that, that stimulus is what results in a change. So it's not just going to all be a walk in the park, but the goal is for it to be under this lens of, this overarching lens of do not harm. So, kind of keep that in mind as you're, working right now, you're training on your own. If you're not quite sure you can do it safely, it's probably not the best plan of attack for your current environment. If you need other resources to do something safely, there's got to be another alternative out there that's going to help you continue to move forward and also, maintain your health and everything else. So the next point is fill in the gaps. And this is looking at what performance measures are helpful to the sport. What are the problem areas for the sport? Planes of motion, we'll talk about those a little bit as well. So there's a couple different planes of motion that, all movement happens using these different planes. And then how do we fill in the gaps without harming, right? So we go back to that overarching point of do not harm. And I'm hoping this is, you guys are starting to see kind of the behind the scenes portion of this whole process. So I'm going to start with the planes of motion. This is just a simple, picture a swimmer next to the different planes. So you have the sagittal plane, you have the coronal plane, which is also known as the frontal, and then the transverse. So you can think as the transverse is kind of your rotational plane. Based off of that, you can think of different movements that, swimming kind of falls into all these different categories. So if I think of a breaststroke kick, it's going to have a little bit of that coronal, the frontal plane in there. You have rotary breathing, right, is going to hit your transverse. And then, your arm action, freestyle arm action, your kick, things like that all happen on that sagittal plane as well. So swimming hits all planes of motion. So we have to have at least a little bit of training that hits all of these planes of motion as well. So based off of what we've seen in studies and honestly from a coaching perspective, this is where a little bit more of the art of coaching comes in as well. Here are some of the gaps that I see swimmers struggling with the most. And the first one is power. So you can think of, your starts, your walls, maintain workload. If you think about that body weight squat test in a minute, the people that can maintain that the athletes that can maintain that higher intensity for longer, usually pan out quite well in a race because they're able to maintain a high quality of form as well. Extension. So if you just throw your arms overhead, reaching as tall as you can, that's, a lot of different joints and muscle groups are extended at that point. That's a common position in swimming. So we already talked about the planes. It uses all three planes. And then you got to think about density. And I'm not saying density in terms of muscle mass or anything like that, but water is much thicker than air. So the way I describe this, if you're running, right, if you're going for a run or a sprint and you have something a little bit out of whack, right, let's say something lower body, your knee is not quite tracking properly. Now let's compare that to kicking in the water and your core body positioning is just a little bit out of whack. What is going to have a greater effect, that knee when you're sprinting or your core body positioning in the water? And the answer to that would be your core body positioning in the water because of the density of water. You can get away with a little bit more on land than you can in water. And that's why core training, in terms of body positioning, being able to control your body as you're rotating, all of those types of things are so important to just being able to work through water more effectively. And if you can do that, you're going to conserve energy, which allows you to have a nice late race kick. If you're burning all that energy trying to thrash around in the water early in the race, good luck getting home in a, meaningful interval that keeps you moving forward. We know vertical pulling, your pull-ups, that makes sense. And then relative strength. So the reason it's not as much absolute strength, and the difference between the two, relative strength is how much strength you express in relation to your body weight. And then absolute strength is just how strong you are. What's like your absolute strength numbers. So absolute strength, for example, generally men have higher numbers of absolute strength, but then when you look at relative strength, it's definitely a lot more even male to female because you're accounting for body weight as well. With swimmers, relative I've found is just a lot more important. And the reason for that is, yes, it's great if you can pull 500 pounds off the floor in a deadlift, but if you're carrying around that amount of muscle mass and have picked up too much muscle mass to achieve that goal, there's a point where there's a diminishing return in the water. So the goal is, we want you strong as you can be within a working body weight that works well for swimming. And that varies from person to person and from event to event. So sprinters, sprinters have gotten bigger and bigger in swimming, and they haven't really hit that threshold point where size has been as too much of an issue. If you're a mid-distance swimmer, sometimes carrying around that extra size is not going to be very helpful when you get to the late portion of a race. But that strength is really important to helping you maintain body positioning throughout throughout that entire race. So you got to kind of balance those things and make sure you're getting the most out of your training in terms of strength, and keeping in mind, where muscle mass falls and everything like that. And like I said, it's person to person, it's event to event. I've worked with athletes who have put on 25 pounds of muscle and been fine. And then I've worked with athletes that have put on 3 pounds of muscle and they feel completely different. So that's something where you're kind of checking in with yourself over time, and you're using your actual performance numbers in the water, not just how you feel, because as your body's changing, you might feel slow, but if the numbers tell otherwise, then it's still working. So that's why swimming's great, because you get to know if it's working based off the times you're putting up on the board. If you're getting faster, but you don't exactly feel the greatest, well, keep in mind in whatever you're doing, because it's working. And you just have to kind of keep track of that. And I know, especially Coach Bullock has said before, you don't have to feel great to swim great. I've heard her say that before, and that's something that's so true, because it's not always about how you feel. If that progress is still showing, it's still going in the right direction. So use the actual data that you have based off of your times, and also use that as a lens to make sure that the dry land is doing what it's supposed to do. If you got to the point where, yeah, you showed strength, but you're starting to drop down, then in time, then that's something, we need to discuss and maybe change course a little bit. Maybe we change and focus on power development more than just that relative strength. So filling in the gaps, next thing, what are the problem areas? And pretty much the entire body when it comes to swimming, if you don't take care of yourself. So one of our future talks will be about the importance of daily mobility, and why that is so important is something I subscribe to as well with my own life. But almost every joint is affected by swimming. So if you look at your shoulders, if you have a lack of range of motion in your shoulders or in your thoracic spine, basically you're not dispersing the force of your upper body correctly for the sport, and that's when pain starts to develop. So what I often see with swimming is the thoracic spine, so that's kind of your middle back, is too knotted up, that you can't get full extension or a full reach with your shoulder. So then you're kind of displacing all that force, and it starts to cause some pain. If we look at hamstrings, if you have really tight hamstrings, chances are you've had low back pain while swimming, because that tightness pulls on your low back. It can cause some back spasms, especially with flip turns. And then you're also missing out on pretty much like free energy, what I call elastic energy. It's kind of like a gift that if you don't have that ability to stretch and then contract and stretch, if you're not getting the fullest range of motion you can, then you're not getting this kind of bounce effect of energy. So you're kind of losing out on this bounce, which just makes it easier for you to be more powerful while conserving energy. So if you think about running, you're not really running super hard, pounding into the ground with each stride. It's kind of like you're just bouncing into the next one, and you're using that energy over and over again. It's the same thing with kicking. If you don't have that ability to stretch and relax and contract and do all that stuff, you're missing out on just this extra that you could have access to. Then hips and knees. The biggest thing I see here is people will have wobbly knees and tight hips. And you're supposed to be able to have stable knees. And that's why it's something, if we're doing a lunge or a squat, you always see minimize side to side knee shake, control your knee position. And then hips should be mobile. They should be able to cover a great range of motion, but often these two joints get switched, which then causes pain for both of them. And then ankles. Ankles are responsible for about 90%, 80 to 90% or more of your propulsion during a kick. So if you have really tight ankles, and that's a studied number, there's a study out there from actually where I went to grad school, George Washington University, that they studied the propulsion aspect of the kick and found that 80+% of it happened below the ankle joint. So it's your ankle, your foot, and working through all of that range of motion. So if your ankle's locked up and you can't get your foot through a full range of motion when you kick, you're losing out on valuable propulsion there. So those are the problem areas that we're generally going to see in the sport of swimming. Next topic, building armor. So I talked about this a little bit earlier. You have to be able to handle the demands of swimming. You have to be able to show up for practice day in and day out and have improvement without having setbacks of missing practice time and things of that nature. And building armor is also a mental thing, resiliency. How well can you bounce back? How well can you get up on the blocks time and time again over the course of 3 or 4 days at some of the bigger meets? And it's just being prepared for what's coming up. So building armor in a nutshell is improving usable range of motion. So think mobility, strengthening that usable range of motion. And strength is honestly one of the greatest preventers of injury. If you're strong enough to hold your body in position, you're not going to have the same injury rate as someone who cannot hold their body in the proper positions. And that comes down to your wrist and holding that position properly, to your shoulder, your elbow, you name it, all of these little positions, to holding your entire body in a straight line in the sport of swimming is strength. That's armor for you to not experience the same rate of injuries that people that cannot do that, or swimmers that cannot do that, will experience. And then improving your performance measures. So how powerful you are, how much work capacity you can handle without doing any harm, right? Because at the end of the day, you're not trying to be the best dryland athlete you can be. You're trying to be the best swimmer you can be. So DRYLAND definitely is there to help, but it's also the backstage portion of things. It's not going out and doing the whole show with the light on it, that it's there to be a helper. And if it's hurting, then, we have to change course and adjust a little bit. So I took a screenshot here. You've probably seen these phrases before, these titles before: training prep and phase prep. This is what, I utilize as kind of my general breakdown for the warm-up portion or building armor portion of your training. And the training prep is really working on range of motion. It's working on overall stability of joints. And the phase prep usually gets into some sort of loaded portion of movement. And the reason for that is once we work on range of motion, loading range of motion after you've just increased it helps hardwire that change into your brain. So that's a great example is foam rolling. So people ask me all the time, is foam rolling okay? I think foam rolling is great as long as you get up and move right after. So what I mean by that is, say you have a really tight quad or whatever, and you have a squat set that day, and say you're able to roll out and you notice a change in your quad range of motion. Awesome. Grab a dumbbell and goblet squat right away. Because what that's going to do is it's going to help hardwire that change between your brain, or from your brain to your musculature and your range of motion. A lot of mobility issues are honestly just communication pathway issues between your brain, sensors in your body, and then the actual muscle. So when I was in high school, I was lucky enough to have an athletic director and a coach that told me this every day I walked into the gym, to the point where it got hardwired into my head. And that's, if you do not have time to train or time to warm up, you do not have time to train. And I always thought it was crazy as a high schooler, because back then I could play basketball for 6 hours a day and not get sore. I could pretty much go hop, jump, and run and do all that stuff without much of a warm up. But I was fortunate enough to have an athletic director and a coach who really, dug in on this topic and did it early enough. And it's honestly, warm up is, for me, it's the most important aspect to everything. And then obviously cool down on the back end is very much important as well. But the reason warm up is important is because, if you think about times you've gotten to practice for swimming, and maybe before you were doing dryland warm-ups and things like that, we'll use some sort of example like that, where you hopped in the water and you just fell off. You're like, man, my shoulder is a little bit achy. I feel a little bit tight, but I'll just swim, 400 or 500 yards and it'll work out. The kinks will work out. Well, that's 400 or 500 yards you probably did with not optimal form. So if we're trying to use every minute to the best of our ability in terms of improving our form, and you're not able to even get into those range of motions until you're 400 or 500 yards in, that's working against yourself a little bit. And that's why a dryland warm up, is something I always try to preach before you're even getting in the water, at a meet, all those things, because you're honestly just working backwards for that first part of the warm up until you work out the kinks. So to me, simply enough. A warm-up can be a bunch of different things. I could pull a bunch of different things out of a hat, but the three keys that I look for are to elevate the heart rate a little bit, to warm the body a little bit, get the muscles warmed up, things like that, and then prepare for the demands. So, if it's a heavy kick set day, maybe a little bit more hip flexor warm up. If it's a heavy pull day, making sure the shoulders are really warmed up, full range of motion, things like that. If it's time to race, let's make sure everything's snappy, ready to go. And so we're prepared for what's coming up. And, if you can do that day in and day out for whatever your training, is looking like, you're going to be in a great position to go out and perform and not have so many steps backwards to go forwards. Think about it. If you're not really warming up before your first stroke in swimming, think about starting your day with a 10% or your practice with a 10% step backwards each time before you're allowed to even go forwards. Like, that's crazy. You don't want to waste that amount of time trying to get back to just an even playing field before you can even show some progress. So moving on to the last point here about what DRYLAND is supposed to accomplish, and then we're going to break it down a little bit more based off of the science of what seems to work and what doesn't. You want to be an athlete. So DRYLAND, is about making you more of an athlete. I'm honestly not as worried about making you a better swimmer. That's your coach's, your swim coach specific role, right? My goal is to make you a better athlete, so then you're able to hold better position in the water. You're able to pull with more power, jump off the blocks further, get off the walls faster. Those are all athletic measures. Those are not just swimming measures. Being able to jump and explode off the ground is the same thing as being able to jump and explode off the blocks if you're looking at a basketball player. And the reason I have this image of LeBron James up, actually I had a really fun talk a few years ago that really shaped or kind of changed my approach to this whole DRYLAND thing. And I was in a room with a couple swim coaches at the Division I level and a couple club coaches as well at really high-end USA swimming clubs. And the question was thrown out, if LeBron James gave up basketball, if we could somehow pay LeBron enough money to get into the sport of swimming, how long do you think it would take for him to break the 50 world record? And honestly, me sitting in there as the only full-time swim coach, I was kind of chuckling and I was like, I don't think it's possible. And I'm just sitting there, kind of tuning into this conversation. Everyone in the room 100% thinks that thought that LeBron could break the 50 world record. And the times that they thought, or the amount of time that he would have to spend swimming, everyone agreed that it would be less than 2 years, some saying less than a year, that LeBron would break the 50 world record in swimming. And that just shocked me to hear these higher level swim coaches saying this. And then so I started thinking about it. And if you kind of look at it, does swimming have the best athletes, right? If we compare it to football or basketball. And the thing is, swimming is a little bit still behind training and performance training measures of some of these other sports. It's something that, for a while, swim coaches might have said, hey, no DRYLAND, we don't believe in resistance training, things like that. And all of those things help. It's not the only way to become a good athlete, but those things can definitely help raise the mean of the athlete in the sport. So it just shows that if we can make better athletes, it seems like world records are going to fall pretty easily. If swim coaches at a high level think LeBron can give up basketball and swim for 2 years or less to break the world record in the 50, man, I'm doubling down on making you guys better athletes. All right. What can I learn from, athleticism that we can bring to the sport of swimming? Honestly, when I started my career, swimmers, I always hear, put a swimmer on land, it's no good. Everything falls apart. Well, maybe that's the reason that performances are plateauing for you as an athlete. Maybe we got to change that interaction you're able to have on land so you can express better in the water what you want to do. Because the forces of land are very, crippling if you're not prepared for them. And there's a lot of carryover to what you can do in the water, even though it's a slightly different medium that you're working. So that story has honestly stuck with me for years now. Just the fact, thinking of LeBron giving up basketball and swimming, although it'll never happen. The fact that such high-level coaches thought it would take less than 2 years for him to break the 50 world record was very eye-opening to me. And hopefully it kind of gives you something to think about. So let's go into a couple other studies here. And this will kind of highlight some things that, we'll talk about in future presentations as well. This first study, we're looking at what dryland measures are good to focus on. Number one is muscle power. So they used a Wingate test on a bike. In terms of you're looking for some other cardio method right now with pools being closed, bike power numbers actually correlate really well to swimming performance numbers. So you see here we have a 50-meter swim speed and mean leg power for this test. And Wingate test, if you've ever done it, is brutal. It's they drop a little weight and you just sprint as hard as you can, and they kind of look at your curves of power and everything. And I had to do a bunch in grad school, and I still haven't mentally recovered from them. But it measures your power, your ability to sustain power, all that type of stuff. So you can see here, if you look at swim speed and overall leg power, and again, this was tested on a bike, you can see that there's a correlation there between the two. And then if you look at 400-meter swim speed and peak sustained workload, again on a bike, there's a correlation there as well. So that's a measure, that's a clue for what we can utilize from a conditioning standpoint right now with all the pools being shut down. And then muscle power and also sustained workload are two things we can focus on from a dryland perspective to make sure that we're getting the most out of training. The next one, this is probably a no-brainer for a lot of you at this point. Long jumps have a positive effect on starts. And that, it's a horizontal jump. It's looking at the force. It's looking at, knee joint, ankle joints, all that type of stuff, peak torque, you name it. Very similar, very much crossover there. So if you've ever done a broad jump in any of your dryland, that's why. Like there's some value there to show that, these measures of your extensors and everything and loading the body with a long jump, or also known as a broad jump, could help your swim performance, especially your starts. And then this last one, I want to talk about from a dryland perspective. This looks at more sprint swimming, but there's some really interesting things here that I think you'll notice some trends from what we do in the gym and how this will help you with your performance moving forward. So these are some bullet points I pulled from the paper. Squat strength significantly correlated with time to 15 meters and peak in horizontal force. So this looked at back squats for this test, and the strength had that correlation with, how fast you can get up to speed up to that 15-meter mark and peak in your vertical and horizontal force. So again, if we go back to planes of motion, we have both of those present in swimming. This second bullet point is really interesting because I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of bench pressing for swimmers, but it's something that definitely pops up in training. I like push-ups a little bit more just because of holding body positioning in there as well. And I like dumbbell benching instead of barbell because of, just a little bit more freedom through the shoulder girdle, a little bit more freedom with your hands to find a position that's not going to cause any discomfort. And this study found that excessive training of the chest muscles could be counterproductive because they're producing force in the wrong direction. And that was a really interesting point for me is, if you look at your training, there's going to be a lot more pulling than pushing, right? And it's because of this process of maybe, that production is not getting us in the right direction. But we have to do enough to balance out all the pulling we're doing as well and make sure that joints are staying stable and everything like that. So there's going to be enough in there to really help you keep everything locked and loaded from an injury prevention standpoint. But if you've ever wondered why, for me personally, I don't really load up the barbell for bench pressing, why I gravitate a little bit more to push-ups, and if I do any sort of benching, it's more dumbbell-based. Here's one example of why. So the next point, the basis of dryland training should be centered around symmetry and enhancing your strength and power. So we've already talked about strength and power. And they think, based off of this study, it's focused really on your starts and your turns. So if you've ever heard a coach say to you, man, if we could just clean up your starts and turns, you would have been golden. Well, dryland training is there to help with that based off of what this study has found. And this study looked at, pull-ups, squat. I think maybe they used a lat pull down, squat, deadlift. Like, it was not a fancy program by any means. Very basic movements that help you mimic a lot of the joint angles without being exactly like swimming on land. And then the last one, strengthening the adductor complex. So think anything that tries to pull your leg together. So if you're trying to pull both legs back together, that's your adductor complex. Is really important for injury prevention purposes. This point is directly related to breaststrokers that have ever pulled their groin when they start increasing the velocity of a kick. And it's also if you've ever tried to hold body positioning, your lower body, and really focus on keeping your legs a little bit closer together, that's all adductor complex. And they recommended, doing things like lateral lunges because it helps with range of motion and help with strength at the same time. So what does this look like from an elite level standpoint? These are the measures from British Swimming. This is what they find with their 1 rep max testing in elite senior swimmers. And you'll notice right off the bat, bench press is in here. They've defined that as a valuable measure. And it's one of those things that they go in and test. But I bet if you looked at their overall programming, it would still gear more toward pulling. And the bench or the push was in there as more of a balancing out of the body. Remember, symmetry. We talked about that based on that previous study. At the bottom here, you can see, 25 kilograms, about 55 pounds, 50 kilograms, about 110 pounds, kind of broken down into different categories. So you can see where these numbers fall. And I thought it was really interesting. If you look at the distance numbers for males and females, you got to have a 165 pound, 75 kilogram, back squat, or a 220 pound, 100 kilogram back squat on the male side. Those are pretty solid numbers for a 1RM test for a distance athlete. So there's still a huge value of strength, even with distance swimmers. And that's something I want you to keep in mind, because sometimes, when working with distance swimmers, like, I don't need to get stronger. Well, if, British Swimming, one of the, quality organizations in swimming in the world, thinks you do, then there's probably some validity there, right? And they've got this data. This is what they observe, and they're using this data wisely. And if you look at the chin-up numbers, right? Look, body weight plus, that means you have that amount of weight strapped to your body weight to complete a chin-up or a pull-up. Those are some crazy numbers there. So obviously vertical pulling, very much a predictor of success. Looks like the back squat, just like we talked about with, time to the 15 meters, all that good stuff. It's all showing here in these elite level numbers that we're seeing for British Swimming. And then finally, this is the last study that I'll focus on, just in terms of giving you some data to think about. And this is honestly just trying to get you to think about these different movements that you're putting in your program, or if you're interested in adding things, or just understanding and trying to figure out what's going to work best for you. This is looking at backstroke force production. And the study found that for the mean level of force that you can produce during the backstroke, this looked at 4 elite swimmers. 1 through 3 were male, and number 4 was female swimmer. And you can see here that they're producing about 53 pounds of force at the high level of this test during the backstroke. So with their arms. So this is looking at arm force. And then the female who did the test, she did about 28 pounds of force in the water. To give you an idea, if you take one of those black TheraBands, the resistance bands, and stretch it to 300%, it gives you about 20 pounds of force. So, I posed that question earlier on, is swimming on land or mimicking swimming on land your best use of your time? And if there's any other study that really points to kind of some data here to show you this, if you can produce about 53 pounds of force during your backstroke in a resistance band, only stretches to about 20 pounds of force at 300%, which I would not recommend doing if that thing snapped, and you're trying to mimic backstroke on land, you're not even hitting the same force you could hit in the water, where if you loaded up a dumbbell row or, a double banded row and not trying to mimic backstroke on land, you could actually get to the pound force that you needed to mimic the force you can actually create in the water. So that's something to keep in mind, just kind of comparing this, not saying resistance bands are bad. We use them all the time and they're super valuable, but if you're trying to mimic a stroke on land and it's taking you to, 300% of a stretch of a band, which I would say is relatively unsafe for a whole lot of time, and it's still not getting you to that pound force that you need to mimic your actual force production in the water, is it the best use of your time? Maybe a single arm row with a band is a better option, to consider, or maybe not. So I have this picture here. I wanted to break down, the kind of the fun behind this topic of, mimicking strokes on land. This is obviously a triathlete or an open water swimmer, but I'm seeing a lot of this on YouTube right now. I'm seeing a lot of this on Instagram, Facebook, you name it, of people, they're mimicking swimming strokes on land. And so my question to you, based off the data that we talked about so far today, is this a good tool for training? And if you haven't fallen asleep yet and you're listening and things sound interesting or you're kind of intrigued, the general answer should be is no. This is probably not the best use of my time from a training perspective. And I know you're probably thinking, if you've done any of the dry land with me, we do something called speed skiers. And I do that for upper body arm tempo and things like that. And there's a quote unquote freestyle variation with a straight arm and a butterfly variation with a double straight arm. So why is that okay for training? We'll sprinkle that in to get that motor unit recruitment and also get your mind recruiting at a higher level with your muscles. And it's a small dose of, if you want to go down that road of swim specific looking activity. But there's a reason we don't do it all the time, right? We only do it in small doses. So training, maybe not the best thing. When would swimming on land be a great alternative? Maybe you're reviewing a video of your swimming and you see where something is going wrong. So say you can see your elbow position is off. You can see your hand position is not where it needs to be. You can use resistance bands to kind of walk through this on land as your coach is talking you through it, or as you're watching the video of yourself and self-correcting. Fantastic use of the bands at that point. Another thing, warm-ups are often crowded, right? If you're going to a meet, and sometimes you can't get the space you need and you just need a little extra time feeling things out. Sure, hook up a band, go through some stroke technique work. And then finally, I love it for pre-race loading. So if you want to just get the muscles a little bit warmed up, get a little bit of load and resistance on your muscles before you get into the water, there's some coaching that I've seen over the years that has helped this, increase the feel of the water for athletes. So they recommend doing some of this right before a race. And I'm talking, 2 heats before you're about to go in, 3 heats before, 10 to 15 minute range before you're getting in the water. So you're getting a little bit of loading there. So training wise, maybe not the best. Here's a couple of practical ways that you can use that and mimic your swimming strokes on land. So I want you to keep these in mind, especially if you have a coach that says, hey, I want you to, to do these exercises because we're mimicking, the strokes on land. Just, keep that in mind. I'm not saying you have to fight your coaches or anything like that and cause a stir, but maybe understand why they're doing it. If they're doing it as a training side of it, maybe ask, is there something else that might be a better route for this? If it's not a training side and there's a goal of feeling out a stroke adjustment and things like that, make sure you understand why you're doing it, what stroke adjustment you're trying to do, just not doing it for the sake of doing it. And that should be with everything in your training. So you might recognize this. This is a snapshot of a week of training. I believe this was back from I think it was like November, December timeframe. And this is how I kind of disguise all of these principles that we just talked about from these studies into the actual dry land training. So we talked about horizontal power, and that was the broad jump, ground reaction force, so how well you can push off the ground and get going. You have your speed hop, so the broad jump in there. So we have that mixed in there. The lateral lunge, we talked about that adductor complex, working on the strengthening and mobility. For this month, we did a front rack variation. Pain management, we talked about it a little bit just based off of the data we're seeing from, elite level swimmers and shoulder pain or, any other pain going on. So there's some rowing options available to get on the rower and still get some training in there as well. Slight clue to another conditioning piece you can use as we're, out of the water right now. And then strength, we talked about that relative strength, using some of your big body movements, your deadlifts, your squats, and using them in a certain capacity that we're not overloading the system too far, but we're stimulating some sort of change. And then you have the option of injury prevention, focusing on problem areas. So we talked about low back, shoulders, all that type of stuff going on, where we're trying to, maintain a certain posture that allows us to be effective in our sport. And then vertical pulling, obviously in there with certain things like pull-ups, and then body positioning with things like planks, different core activation activities, and not just general crunches, right? We're trying to be a little bit more advanced with core training. A heavy squat, a heavy deadlift is still core training as well. But you can see how these things are all in different phases of the programming. And it's not that we're always hitting every single thing each training session, but we're getting some doses of these over the course of a week and month, and then, obviously a season. And that's what we're going to find. Something's going to stick for you. It's going to work. Something's going to hit a weakness for you. And something then will be improved if you stick with it. And that's what we're trying to do. So you can kind of see how these are all really disguised. You might have thought it was just a front rack lateral lunge to be mean, or, I don't know, a QL floor stretch because your back's tight or whatever, but there's this bigger focus that we're trying to keep all these pieces together and move forward. So taking that information, this was a post from a Russian swimmer. You guys might know her, especially with her battles with Miss King from the US at the last Olympics. They kind of had a nice back and forth. And this is, total disclaimer, this is not to poke fun at her. She's an elite level athlete, and she's searching for any little thing to make her Olympic gold type of moment. So this, again, before I even dive into this is not poking fun at anyone. This is just using this as an example. And so she posted this, and you can't see, but there's someone holding her feet off the side of her counter there, and she's just mimicking strokes in her kitchen essentially. And then the far right image was her doing this bouncing activity that she was, basically trying to look like a breaststroke kick and kind of having that elastic bounce of a breaststroke kick. And so based off of what we talked about today, I just kind of want you to look at this type of stuff. And although it looks cool and it looks exciting and everything, does it fit the data that we have, and does it fit the historical coaching information that we have to get you moving forward in the best possible route? And for her, maybe that's a yes. I can't say what she's doing, but I would tell you to be aware that this is a snapshot in time. This is not showing you her entire training program. And I think, although it was a really cool display of this strength and capability, and, definitely got a nice rouse out of the social media world, you have to keep in mind that there's something there. There's a reason she posted it on social media. If it was actually meant to be a trade secret or one of the big secrets of her success, I doubt she would have been posting it for everyone else to see. So I want you to comb through social media with that kind of approach. Make sure your source, is something is actually going to show value and value for you in your current situation. If you're going for an Olympic gold, then maybe this is the difference between you winning gold and not medaling. But if you haven't really walked her walk yet, and, I'm putting aside all the, obviously the steroid use and things like that have come up over her career. But if you haven't walked her walk as a training side of things, or you haven't walked the walk of one of your elite level, idols that you look at in the swimming world, then don't expect to do exactly what they're doing, because there's some steps you have to take beforehand. And so when I look at social media, especially with elite level athletes, number one, I want you to think of it as the tip of the iceberg, because there's a whole lot of training, there's a whole lot of nutrition, there's a whole lot of, mental training, you name it, that we're not seeing from a 60-second Instagram post. So be very aware of that as you're trying to sprinkle this stuff in. It might look flashy, it might look cool, but have you taken care of the basics to earn the right to go to that level of your training, right? If you have not taken care of the basics, for example, if you still struggle with a squat and getting full range of motion with a squat, start there. You're going to get more out of your training that way in the long run. And then I also think about it in her case, right? She's been at the Olympic Games a few times now. I think she's a multi-world champion, if I remember correctly. She's like this towel over here. Her training's like this towel. She's trying to wring out any last drop she can to hit an elite level of performance at the Olympic level. Not saying you shouldn't wring out any sort of towel or you shouldn't try to get as much out of your training as you can, but make sure you follow the steps of the iceberg so you actually get to that tip of the iceberg. And then you can start experimenting with that little bit of, adjustment to try to get that little extra edge when it comes down to, your moment. But a lot of you are in a stage right now, and honestly, most of us spend our entire life in the stage of just getting really good at the basics, and that's going to lead to improvement. And I know I've told my Kobe Bryant story that I heard on the podcast where, he did basic drills for 3 hours and people were asking where all the flashy stuff was. And he was like, I'm not great because I do all flashy things. I'm great because I do the basics so well, nobody can stop me. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, the basics are there for a reason. Social media is usually a small snapshot. And if this is truly part of her training, I would argue it's probably not a very big chunk of it. So be careful making it a big chunk of yours. So in the end, this is a quote from Keenan Robinson. He's the head of sports performance for USA Swimming. I had the privilege of meeting him when I lived in Austin and talking training with him and everything. Really cool guy. Trained Michael Phelps since he was a little kid. This is his quote from one of his Q&A sessions the other day. He said, if you want to get good at freestyle, swim freestyle. It's that simple. The DRYLAND's here to help. It's here to make you more equipped to accomplish what you want to accomplish. But at the end of the day, it's there to make you a better, more well-rounded athlete so you can go out and swim a better freestyle. But to truly get to that point, you have to swim freestyle. So keep that in mind with your training. I hope this kind of prompted some talking points for you to think about, your own training. Think about what you might have added over the years or what you see, and kind of go with a different lens as you're going through this whole process, and especially when you're looking at what's out there to do and what to accomplish. And then I sent these links out earlier. You can feel free to check those out. These are all the different studies and things like that I referenced. Keep in mind, there's plenty of studies out there that can show anything you want to show. So those are just some examples I found to really help, kind of show some points here. So what I'll do now, if you have any sort of questions, I'm going to go to the chat, and you can go ahead and type any sort of questions you have in there. And then, I can take time to answer.